Hello, thank you all for joining us for today's program, which is generously supported by the museum's Friends of Asian Art Group. My name is Dani Chan, and I am the Associate Curator of Asian Art at the Walters Art Museum. Before we get started, I would like to make the following acknowledgement. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Susquehannock and Piscataway nations that originally inhabited this land, the tribal groups, including the Lumbee and Cherokee that migrated here, and the indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects we steward in our collection. To learn more, please visit the link posted in the comments. Also, please note that this program is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel and Facebook page. As you may know, this season, all of the talks in this series are focused on the museum's Asian and Islamic art collections to coincide with the opening in April of our new galleries across Asia, Arts of Asia and the Islamic World. Today's speaker is Dr. Pia Brancaccio, Professor of Art History at Drexel University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Pia will guide us through the unique multicultural nature of Buddhist art in Gandhara during 4 centuries of activities in this region. She will also discuss recent discoveries from archaeological excavations in northern Pakistan, as they shed new light on how Buddhist Gandharan art was connected to thriving urbanism in the region. Pia's research focuses on early Buddhist art in South Asia and cross-cultural exchange, with a special focus on the ancient regions of Gandhara and the Western Deccan. She is a longtime collaborator of the Italian Archaeological Mission in Pakistan and has published extensively on Gandharan art and Buddhist cave temples in Maharashtra, India. And finally, March is Women's History Month, and it is our honor to acknowledge and celebrate the important role of female scholars, such as Pia, in the field of South Asian art history in the United States. If you have questions during the talk, please leave them in the comments and we'll address them during the Q&A. Now, please join me in welcoming Pia Brancaccio to our program. Welcome, Pia.
Thank you very much. And let me share the screen and make sure that you're viewing my presentation, correct?
Yes.
You can, I hope. So let me start by thanking Dani and Annie for inviting me to share some of my research with you today. And thank you all for being live and for devoting part of your afternoon to Gandharan art. So let me start by saying that the talk today will take you to explore the roots, the multicultural roots of Gandharan art. And we will focus on the cultural context that led to the formation of this distinctive visual idiom in northwestern India around the beginning of the Common Era. So I'd like to open with actually a brief slide that brings together the family of Gandharan artwork that are in your wonderful collection. And actually, these pieces reflect the range, variety, materials, and themes representative of the Buddhist artistic tradition of Gandhara. From relief carvings with narrative themes depicting stories from the Buddha's life, such as the one on the top left, to architectural elements that actually combine Western architectural forms, such as capital with acanthus leaves and figures in them. We have then a remarkable stucco head in plaster, which is very well representative of the tradition of stucco as a sculptural material in Gandharan art. What you have here is a beautiful Buddha head. The top part of the head is actually missing, the Ujnisha. And again, on the bottom, you'll see you have this wonderful seated Buddha in a preaching gesture, which was clearly a sculpture as an object of devotion. And we'll try also to explore where such images were placed within the Gandharan Buddhist sites. And again, we have a nice narrative reliefs depicting the worship of a pillar with 3 chakras, monumental pillar, 3 chakras, 3 wheels, probably representing the 3 jewels of the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha, the Dharma, his doctrine, and the monastic order. And last, on the bottom right, is an image of a bodhisattva sitting in meditation, which is actually quite interesting because there you can see these 2 holes on the halo of the bodhisattva. I'm talking about the piece accession number 25,257. You'll see these 2 holes pierced on the halo, which speak for the actually installment of the image in a particular niche. So how images, Buddhist images, were actually attached to sites or to particular monuments to be worshipped. So quite a good range of images here, very representative of the ancient artistic production from Gandhara. We're looking mostly at Buddhist art, and we're looking at Buddhist art coming from a region that today encompasses eastern Afghanistan, northern Pakistan, and the northwestern regions of like Punjab and India. The truth is, Gandhara proper refers to the area surrounding Peshawar and Islamabad, Taxila. But in the scholarship, we often refer to Greater Gandhara as this broader cultural region that you see here comprised within the blue circle, where actually Buddhist art from around the beginning of the Common Era really reflected a shared taste, style, and the sort of cross-cultural flavor, if you wish. So really, when we look at Gandharan art, we're mostly looking at sculpture that was produced sometime really between the 1st century BC and the 3rd CE. The truth is, the bulk of the Gandharan production really dates between the 1st and the 3rd century CE, to the time when the Kushan rulers controlled this vast region. However, recent archaeological discoveries have demonstrated that the artistic production in Gandhara, the Buddhist artistic production, continued well into the 6th century, differently from what was thought before. So we're looking now at kind of the broader chronological spectrum, and as we will see, with interesting shifts in themes and materials that help us understand this broad chronology and broad developments within the local artistic and religious tradition. When we speak of Gandharan art, we mostly refer to Buddhist art that is Buddhist in themes, and we mostly refer to sculpture, freestanding sculptures representing images of Buddhas, bodhisattvas, or Buddhas to be, enlightened beings who are actually actively postponing nirvana in order to help everyone else reach the Buddhist goals. And we're also looking at a lot of relief carvings, narrative themes that depict life stories of the Buddha or maybe celebration scenes, and lots of architectural elements. Many of these life stories were actually figural pieces that were inserted within architectural structures. When we talk about Gandharan art, we mostly refer to stone sculpture, usually schist, very distinctive stone gray in color, which is the stone available mostly in actually the Pakistani side of Gandhara. So we're looking at mostly the area of Peshawar, Jalalabad, and when we enter into Afghanistan, we start finding more and more plaster and more stucco. We also have to think that all these images were painted in the past. And so we are really kind of having a kind of partial sense for what Gandharan art looked like. And again, what makes Gandharan art really so unique and so distinctive is this sort of combination of Eastern and Western taste. And precisely this kind of cross-cultural elements that are so visible in the Gandharan style, we will talk about that in a second, are those elements that made Gandharan art most appealing to Western audiences, frankly speaking, since the time when the British ruled India. And in fact, I want to take you briefly to the very beginning of collecting Gandharan art, which is actually linked to the presence of British military forces in the Northwest both Pakistan and Afghanistan, at the very beginning, end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. What you see here on your screen are actually instances of reuse of Gandharan art. And I apologize for the image on the right. It's actually the images published in a very, this sort of, it's from an old book, and very much the grain is not, it's just not a great picture. But on your screen, you can see Gandharan reliefs mounted in a mantelpiece of a fireplace in the guides' mess at Mardan. This was a place where the military would gather to rest and relax after their campaigns in the regions of Malakand and Chitral in the northern part of Pakistan. As they were trying to control those valleys, they actually harvested, literally removed the sculptures from stupas and remounted it in different ways to kind of enjoy it in their leisure time. I mean, this appropriation is clearly showing the sort of sense of appropriation of a culture that was diverse from their own. A sense of conquest was associated with it. But also, what is remarkable is that these pieces were reused in contexts similar in which classical pieces were reused in the big country house of England at the time. Mantelpieces were often made from reused fragments of Roman reliefs or copies of them. And in the British gardens abounded this sundials made again from reused classical pieces. So this is how the earliest collections of Gandharan art were formed. And after that, this with creation of laws, actually, even during the British time, many of these pieces were then brought to the very first colonial museums. So this is really the beginning of the history of interest in Gandharan art. And really this connection between East and West is well visible in the visual idiom employed by Gandharan artists to represent Buddhist images. You can see here on your screen a standing Buddha, and right next to it an image of a togatus from Rome, that dating pretty much to the 1st century CE. And you can see that the Gandharan works really highlight, in particular the standing Buddha, this sort of interest in representing the drapery so richly, and also the position of the body in a sort of slightly hinted contrapposto underneath the Buddhist robe. And again, you can see in the smaller images, Buddha heads with hairstyles that recall the treatment of hairstyle in early imperial figures from the Roman world, or again, the sort of copies of late Hellenistic sculptures that became so important in Rome and in the Roman world, clearly may have informed in part the formation of this unique visual style of Gandharan art. And to give you a sense of how Gandharan art was in reality in dialogue with some of these Western forms, I'd like to show you this slide in which I compare a Gandharan Buddha on one side with a contemporary Mathura Buddha from North India. So these two image types were contemporary. You can clearly see how the Gandharan image elaborates the Buddha type in a completely different way. And so you can really see to which extent images from Gandhara really draw from a very sort of multicultural visual idiom. So my question here is then, when and how did this happen? I would like to take you to explore, to take you to the roots of this multicultural, this sort of multicultural style, if you wish, of Gandharan art, and to look at the periods that precede the establishment and the diffusion of Gandharan art in the Northwest, because they help us understanding the source of this distinctive Buddhist art. So as we look at Gandhara, as we look at this particular area of the world, this province actually situated at the crossroads of Asia, we see that there's its position really lent itself to this kind of successive occupation from different powerful kingdoms, both from the east and from the west. The Achaemenid Empire, in fact, conquered Gandhara, and the term Gandhara, the name Gandhara itself, starts really with the sort of Persian period of occupation, where between the 6th and the 5th century, Gandhara was a Persian province, a province of the Achaemenid Empire. So the name Gandhara lingered for many centuries after, and that's where the source of this term comes from. One major turning point in the history of Gandhara, and one that is particularly relevant to us as we try to examine this sort of incredibly rich and multicultural flavor of the artistic production, is the conquest of the Northwest by Alexander the Great. And that happens in the 4th century, 326, 327 BCE, and that is followed immediately with a strong sort of counteraction by the Maurya Empire from India. The Mauryas take over the land conquered by the Greeks. However, the Greek tradition lingers in the Northwest. And we see that from the 3rd to the 1st century BCE, we have a succession of Indo-Greek kingdoms, or Greek sort of kingdoms who are somehow tied to Greek culture and Greek traditions. And this really leads right before the diffusion of Buddhism in the region and precedes the advent of the Kushans of the first centuries of the current era, in which we have really a booming Gandharan art tradition. So it's really in this sort of first centuries preceding the current era that we see this formation, this exposure to Greek taste in the region, to Hellenistic taste, obviously. And what I'd like to actually show you now is not just more Hellenistic art, but actually try to look at material culture from the Northwest, from Pakistan. I'd like to take you to the recent archaeological excavations conducted in Swat, in the northern regions of Pakistan, to show you really the diversity of material culture in the region, which is not only the fact that there were artistic models coming from far away, but actually that the sort of local context, social and cultural context, was deeply, in a way, Hellenized. Before we get there, I also would like to point out that in the centuries that followed the presence of the Kushans in ancient Gandhara, the ones that are outside the blue square here on my outline and marked in red, are also times in which Gandharan art continued to be produced on a reduced scale, on a different scale, but it continued to be sort of active. And so right now we are actually revising our parameters, and we're realizing that there was a lot of Buddhist support at several sites in the region, even after the end of the Kushan period. So here is actually a map of the sites. Many archaeological sites have been explored and documented in Gandhara. And I would like to take you to the region of Swat, which is the region marked by this big blue arrow on the top. And I'd like to take you actually to the area of Mingora, where you have many Buddhist sites there. But I'd like to take you to a city instead. You know, one of the issues is that we always talk about Buddhist art in connection with Buddhist sites, and that's the way it should be. But we tend to forget that Buddhism was also actively practiced in the cities. We do have very few archaeological excavations, actually, of settlements, urban settlements in the region. So one of them, which has been actually going on for many years and going strong in the last campaigns, last few years, is the city of Barikot or Birkot one day, situated in in Swat, along the banks of the Swat River. And this city has been excavated by the ISMEO Archaeological Mission in Pakistan, the Italian Archaeological Mission. And I have to thank the director, Luca Olivieri, for I've been collaborating with them, so for sharing all this material. with you today. And these cities seems to have been actually the ancient Basira or Beira, which is one of the two towns conquered and garrisoned by Alexander the Great in the autumn of 326 BC, as he made his way from actually Macedonia, Iran, and so forth into the northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent. On the right, you can see this map of the advance. The red dots mark the advance of the Alexander army, and you can see the sort of Mount Aornus marked there. We know everything about this expedition because historians, Alexander's historians, wrote about it. And we can actually identify with good certainty the mount described by Alexander historians with Mount Elam, that's kind of towering the ancient city of Basira. So what are we looking at is actually a city that was then garrisoned and became a Hellenistic city in northwestern Pakistan. And I want to give you a sense of the cultural layering of this environment. And you can see on the on your screen this selection of coins that show actually the layering of the cultural sequence of the town. So from the Mauryan coins on the very top to the coins that are actually put forth by the Indo-Greek rulers in the area. And you can see that the coins in the bottom part, found all in archaeological context, they have Greek inscriptions and they follow the models of Greek coins. Another something else that gives us a sense of the multicultural nature of this town is the ceramic production. Okay, ceramic is part of the material culture of a place, very distinctive actually, and helps us understanding the cultural background of people in antiquity and their degree of exchange with other cultures. What we see on the ceramic is inscriptions in Greek, in Aramaic, in Brahmi. We find fish plates in the middle of the Himalayas mountain. So we are looking at plates that clearly fragments today that refer to ceramic forms that were common in the actually Hellenistic world. So you can sense and here you can have all the sort of cultural layering of the city and understand this kind of coexistence of Indic and foreign material within one particular place at the foothill of the Hindu Kush. Another interesting thing that is hardly brought up, but I think is really remarkable because it does speak for the cultural affiliation of this urban center. And in particular, I would like to briefly talk about Hellenistic loom weights found in Barikat, in Swat, in Pakistan. Now, loom weights are excellent household, sort of excellent indicators of household production and sort of domestic life. And they really may be used, and they are used also in the archaeology of the Mediterranean to track social change between diverse cultural environments in time. So at some point, we see appearing the use of Hellenistic looms in this town. And you can see how this loom weights and how the sort of they were used in a loom that looked like the one depicted on this vase. So clearly, we are looking at a place where material culture is also heavily Hellenized. So it's not just sort of a dialogue between different artistic forms, but we do have a consistent presence of actually Hellenized material culture, Western material culture. This can be also seen in this sort of in grinding stones that were used in the city to grind cereal. And we can also see that connection between Hellenistic traditions and the ceramic from the region in the findings of this very odd things. These are called Lasanas. They are this ceramic shapes in which you put hot coal to warm up food. So they're like portable little warmers that you can have. And these are so distinctive of the Greek world, and we find them all the way in Barikat in Pakistan. So we're looking before the arrival of the Kushan kings at a very sort of Hellenized cultural environment where diverse cultures are present there. This is Indic tradition. This is India. This is an Indic world, but we do have a lot of Greek elements in the material culture. Then the Kushan kings from the Western Asia move in and control the area and locate themselves really at the crossroad of this world. And they start issuing gold coins. They start trading with Rome. And it is at this time that the image of the Buddha is produced. And you can see it here, even one of the Buddha images on the coin. This trade with Rome kind of reinforced this sort of cross-cultural interest of the region from the Kushan citadel of Begram in Afghanistan. An interesting array of important objects have been discovered by French archaeologists in the 60s. And this is to give you a sense. Now, we looked at material culture in the pre-Kushan period, and now we're looking at artistic materials that are imported because they are seen as beautiful, clearly, by the people of the time. And imported because of their artistic price, probably. And we have, seals with Athena. We have an image of a satyr or Dionysus. We have an image of Harpocrates touching his lips. We have Indian ivories used for thrones and a beautiful one of the many Roman glasses found at Begram. So we are looking at yet another level of interaction with the Western world, and one that brought a lot of artistic prototypes straight into the Kushan region. And this is really the dialogue between this Begram material and the Gandharan tradition, contemporary, of course. It's well exemplified by this piece in your collection. You can see how the female bust inserted in this capital with the acanthus leaves is clearly a reflection. It's really based on this model of a Athena, but it's not a full standing sculpture. This is a bronze weight. So it's actually quite remarkable because it also gives us a sense of how these visual models may have traveled from the Western world to Gandhara into the Kushan period proper. So when Buddhism starts becoming an important force in the Northwest, with the arrival of the Kushans, really we see this great impetus in the sponsorship of Buddhist monuments. And we can say that it's really with the 1st century CE that Buddhist art booms in the Northwest. The Kushans are clearly involved in the sponsorship of Buddhism, but really the patrons of Buddhism in Gandhara are the small local rulers who actually became the big sponsors of stupas and Buddhist monuments and Buddhist art. Stupas are dome-shaped relic monuments, like the one you see on the screen here, that were built to enshrine reliquaries, just like the one you see on your screen. These reliquaries were containers that had stored in it a pinch of bodily relics from the Buddha, whatever remains were there from the cremation of the Buddha many, many centuries prior to that. And what's interesting in Gandhara is that some of these reliquaries are inscribed, like the one that you see here in the Metropolitan Museum with this inscription, very elaborate, that tells us that the reliquary and the stupa that enshrined it was clearly sponsored not by a big Kushan king, but a local king of Swat, a king of the Apracha and lineage. And again, he's given this gift for a better rebirth. And bodily relics are clearly mentioned, and also the fact that these relics were brought in procession. So this is really remarkable because we have evidence of Buddhist rituals centered around the cult of relics in Gandhara. So monuments were established, and art is clearly plugged within this architectural context. So the Buddhist sculptures that we have, for instance, at the Walters, they all come from sites similar to the one that we see on the screen. They either came from environments where you had these big stupas, big relic monuments, and subsidiary monuments around, or sites where you had a big monastic settlement and, again, a stupa within it for worship. So these are the main typologies of monuments you see in the Gandharan world, from where our images come from. And as you can see from the landscape, these monuments were situated usually not really down in the flat plains, but on the hills right next to major valleys where transit of people and devotees would ensure support for the sites. So let's look at the placement of our Gandharan images. We always see them in museum collections, and it's hard to kind of imagine how they were at the time when these images were in worship. So I thought I'd take you to those places for a moment, and I'd like to show the placement of statues of the Buddha in Gandhara. Well, once, of course, images of the Buddha were created around this time, prior to this period, prior really to the Kushan period. We have very few, we don't really have images of the Buddha represented in human form. So we have a lot of aniconic imagery. So the Gandharan art in the advent of the Kushans in the Northwest marked the development of iconic art in that particular region. And so images were actually produced in great abundance, and they were all placed in these chapels in sacred areas surrounding major stupas. They were always placed in proximity of larger stupas holding relics. And you can see here the court of the Taktibai monastery, when the stupa is not there any longer. I kind of reconstructed with a sort of blue outline, but you have to imagine on that square podium a stupa and then a dome with the relics, and then you'll have all these chapels around with Buddha images in them. Some Buddha images were standing, some Buddha images would be seated images in the small chapels, so you would have quite an array of figures around enshrining the relic. Not only that, but a lot of narrative carvings, much like the image of the Buddha in Parinirvana that you have on the screen, the Buddha from the collection, from the Walters collection, they would be actually adorning the bodies of miniature stupas, miniature relic monuments that surround the larger relic monument at these sacred sites. So these sites, these Buddhist sites, were really where all the carvings would be found, and where most of them, you'll see there were some also in urban environment, but most of the material that we have around comes from some of the sites. Now, one of the features of Gandharan art is its narrative emphasis, and that's really a big thing because when compared to previous tradition of narrative art in the subcontinent, Gandharan art seemed to emphasize really a chronological sequence, the chronological development of the life of the Buddha. Art in Gandhara tells a story that is the story of a hero that begins and ends, and that develops in a linear and sequential manner. Not only that, but this life is actually told in visual manner, shown in reliefs that are placed around small votive monuments that are viewed by devotees as they walk around the monument, just like the central slide shows. So in essence, devotees would walk around stupas and look at episodes sequentially. They would just almost kind of view a movie about the life of the Buddha. So they would start from looking at the Buddha's conception, bottom left on your screen, then go on to the birth, then go into other scenes of his early youth. Actually, in Gandhara, the artists seem to be especially interested in telling stories from the youth of the Buddha. It's interesting. There is this fascination with this career, this early formation, which is the formation of a nobleman, or at least the Buddha receives all the training as a child, perhaps the same training that an Apracha king, a local king, would receive. And then I couldn't show them all here. And then, the story goes on to the Enlightenment and all his miracles and conversions, and then eventually to the moment of death or nirvana. So it's a life story, essentially, in Gandhara, that is told chronologically in carvings. So these panels are actually small. They average about 20-25 centimeters in height because they are attached to small dome-shaped stupas that are positioned in these areas. Sometimes the Gandharan artists decide actually to represent many scenes on one single slab of stone. So you actually have the sequence recorded quite well in this sequence. And one thing I'd like to point out here, that many life scenes of the Buddha are actually kind of carved in combination with genre scenes that represent sometimes, people celebrating, and sometimes people dressed in Western garb, as you can see here, holding shields or all sorts of kind of genre imagery that is often making connection with celebratory imagery that we find in the Greek or Roman world. We have a lot of things, for instance, a lot of instances where wine drinking is represented in Gandharan stupas. This is an example of a piece from possibly coming from a stupa, where we have this sort of Dionysus and Maenads drinking wine. We also have other genre scenes of Gandharan stupas that perhaps represents this, what I think actually are actors, they're figure performing, talking, recitating. Maybe there is a connection with Western drama here. So we are looking at a world that is strongly aware of these Western traditions and is integrating these visual modes within Buddhist art. And one thing I'd like to briefly talk about is the fact that we always think about Buddhist art in Buddhist settings, in Buddhist monuments, stupas, monasteries, but actually Buddhist art has been found also in urban environment. The work at the done by the archaeological mission, in Italian archaeological mission in Pakistan at Barikat, has recently uncovered in the last year of work two incredible dwelling units that show a significant sort of religious area devoted to religious practice. And in particular here, I'll be talking about this sort of tabernacle, this shrine that you see in the bottom part of the front part of the slide, that actually was uncovered in a phase of actually collapse. But you can see that the images, the Buddhist images, very similar in size and type to the one, for instance, that we have in the Walters Museum, in the Walters collection. They were actually attached, affixed to the back wall of the shrine, and they were assembled, different images together for worship. And you can see there is this small image of a figure holding something. That is a figure of a devotee. It's a little sculpture emblematic of the devotee offering to the Buddha. So we're looking here at Buddhist art in the city. And this is something that we often don't think about and tend to forget. And in fact, these images are not huge in size. So many of the images that we find in collections may have come from actually urban sites, ancient urban Gandharan sites. We also have temples, places dedicated. We'll see very interesting environments where clearly there were shrines and actually it was a treasury where offerings were probably stored. And I'm talking about the dwelling unit K in the city of Barikat. You can see up in the diagram, you have a model right there, a drawing right there with the outline, the profile of the fortification of the city, which was then rebuilt after conquest of Alexander in a Western Greek manner. And then inside the city, you do have a temple, a Buddhist kind of sacred area, small one, with sort of a space designated with a stupa, the one that you see encircled by a red square on the screen. And then right next to it, an image of a seated Buddha, clearly for worship. And one of the most interesting things of this sacred area, urban sacred area, is the fact that the archaeologists uncovered a room in the back of this unit where they found a distinctive assemblage of ceramic that you see here, and actually an entire elephant tusk, a whole elephant tusk that was probably given as an offering. And this is really interesting because we talking about ivory as an offering in the Buddhist context. We know ivory was widely associated with the Buddha. The Buddha was, after all, conceived through this white elephant that appeared to Maya, the mother, in her dreams, and kind of poked her on her side. And texts and inscriptions say that actually the white elephant was the Buddha. So this ivory is a material that has great relevance within the Buddhist tradition. And as you know, ivory tusks were also given in Sri Lanka, for their steady, like a presence at Buddhist sites. And it's remarkable to find this already so early in the Northwest. One thing very quickly I want to take you through is the variety of materials that we have in Gandharan art. So we talked about ivory as a material. In fact, ivory, small sculpture in ivory is found only later and in Kashmir, in Buddhist Kashmir. But in Gandhara, we do find a lot of stone. As we said, we mostly looked at stone today, stucco, plaster. And we find in Afghanistan especially, unfired clay that in many cases became accidentally burned and turned into terracotta or fired clay. All of this was painted and gilded in many cases, and traces of red pigment on sculpture actually usually serve as the base of pigment of gilding. So they're not really sometimes red colors, just red is the base for applying this sort of very thin gold pigment on the sculpture. So very colorful sites we have to imagine. And also another thing I would like to show is how at some point there is a preference for stucco over stone in Gandhara. And that's really in the, stucco already exists during the Kushan period, but it's in the post-Kushan period. So in, like, say, 4th century that we start seeing a lot of plaster images, and this is much less narrative, and stupas decorated with series of Buddha images repeated over and over. Plaster, of course, is much cheaper material, and if you think about actually earthquakes in this part of the Pakistan, it's really certainly much more convenient to work in stucco. And actually stucco also lends itself to making sculptures of larger dimensions. And just very quickly, I just wanted to take you to this very brief study of how the Gandharan people worked stucco. There's been a remarkable investigation into Gandharan stucco done at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And these actually helps us understanding how these artistic workshops operated in the Northwest. And this is actually the back of a Gandharan hat in plaster. We rarely see the back of sculptures, but the back of sculptures actually reveal us a great deal about knowledge, artistic know-how, about artistic workshops, about makers. And so this is, I just wanted to offer you a quick example of that kind of information that the back of a head can give us. Going to stucco can also be made on a monumental scale. So what we see is that with time, we tend to, until now, we kind of were of the opinion that Buddhism really thrived under the Kushan, and after that, it really started to disappear because these honey groups moved into Gandhara. The narrative was that they brought destruction and all Buddhist patronage of Buddhist sites ended. Archaeological investigations in the region have not confirmed this picture. In fact, they have shown that at some sites, patronage continued even stronger and bigger. And that's literally the case at Takhti Bai, where in the 4th, and we'll see later centuries, 4th and 5th, we have these colossal images of the Buddha in plaster that are inserted in these huge niches that surround the stupas. So smaller niches with smaller stone images were removed to make way to these enormous shrines that were intended to have this beautiful plaster Buddhas attached to the back. This is eventually what will lead to Bamiyan, to the great monumental Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan, the one that were destroyed by the Taliban many years ago. So we have evidence of colossal, large-size Buddhist images, like 4 meters or more. Here is another example from the site of Takhti Bai. This photo shows sockets for images, and the heads are the only things that were found at the time of the excavation of the site, the heads and the feet on the bottom of these walls. Here you have, this is actually a photo in the British Museum, in the British Library, documenting excavations at Takhtibai. And you can see here this beautiful, large size head and feet. That's all that remains of this colossal Buddhas made in plaster. And last but not least, before ending our survey of Gandharan art, kind of quick, brief, and intense and dense, I'd like to take you to another recent discovery. So we talked about painted sculpture, but the truth is all the Gandharan sites, whether within the city, Gandhara Buddhist sites, or within monasteries, or just religious sites in general, they were all painted. So all of the paintings are gone. We have very few fragments that survive, decorating large stupas in the Swat Valley. But recently in Taxila, Pakistani archaeologists uncovered the decoration of a Buddhist monastery at the site of Jinanwali Deri. The archaeologists dated the material found to the 5th century CE, as well as the paintings that you can see. They are in a very fragmentary state. They were wall paintings that were decorating the monastery. And so we can see already that in the 5th century, we still have patronage of Buddhist paintings and Buddhist monastery in the Taxila area. And as we look closer, this very sort of poor fragments, a poor condition of paintings from Jinan Walideri, we can't but notice the close similarities with the painting traditions of India that developed. Actually, we have examples in the cave temples of Ajanta in Maharashtra, and these paintings also date from the 5th century. So what we're seeing here, we're seeing actually a continuous artistic tradition in Gandhara that flourished with a lot of interaction with different cultural milieux, from the, again, early Hellenistic models to the Roman types that enter with Kushan trade, to the sort of, we're looking at Indian culture, the thriving of Buddhism, and then this return, or this reemergence of very distinctive Indic models in the painting tradition from Gandhara. And with this, I'm just checking the time, and I think I should end here to leave you time for discussion and question. And I'd just like to thank you for your time, and I hope you have questions, and I look forward to answering them. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Pia. That was a fascinating survey. And so one question from me to start us off. I'm curious about the intended audience for the Gandharan Buddhist art, especially those found in the the sacred sites or the temple sites. Because when you mentioned the urban setting of Buddhist art, I was wondering, were these sculptures that are, Hellenistic or Greco-Roman in nature, were they primarily for the local practitioners, or were there visitors or converts from outside the region that would also visit?
Yes. So my sort of image, I mean, what I gather is that we are really looking at a truly multicultural population. Because if you look at this Greek pottery shards in Greek, so we're looking at a diverse group of people really living in the area. So I imagine that the people who use those, that worship those Buddhists, I'd like to think about quite a diverse cultural milieu right there too. I mean, we do have inscriptions are very helpful, because sometimes from names, you can tell the language, or at least the origin of a people or a family, etc. And they're very diverse names. You find names that are clearly Iranian sounding. You find names that are really Greek sounding or Parthian sounding. You have Indic names. So it's quite a diverse milieu. And Buddhist was a religion that became quite popular among traders in the Indic subcontinent. And this is a region where trade was one of the main economic resources. So I'd like to think that a lot of that, when a lot of those people who were engaged were urbanites, and they were from families of different origins, and they converted to Buddhism. And Buddhism is quite a flexible religion. It doesn't matter where you're from, who you are from. It's about practice too. So you don't have this sort of you can be flexible. You don't need to read a lot of text. You can just be a good Buddhist without the need of accessing Buddhist sources. And one thing I actually omitted to mention is that from Gandhara, a large number of Buddhist manuscripts have been surfacing in recent years. They're written on birch bark, and they, again, are random finds. They were probably looted somewhere and came to the market. And what's interesting about them is that what they talk about is not what we see in the art. So it's almost like there is a monastic tradition that is the tradition of the book, so to speak, of the text and the literature. And then there is a tradition of images that is depicting certain themes and focusing on certain images. And so I think a lot of work needs to be done on this.
Yeah, that's exciting. And so we have a comment from Ani Proser on Facebook. She says, "Hello, Pia. Thank you for this wonderful introduction to Gandhara. Could you talk a little bit about the condition of the sites that you have been showing? Does that reflect the results of the impact of British colonialism, earlier invasions, earthquakes, recent archaeological projects, or all of the above?"
I'll go with all of the above, actually. And what we see today is actually the results of all of the above. And there were early looting, like in many of the stupas, like the one I've shown, the only big stupa I've shown with a big kind of splash in the middle, big opening, okay, big wound in the middle. Well, actually, when the British were in the region, they had learned that big stupas had relics inside. And the reliquary not only had relics of the Buddha, but had coins, gold coins. And sometimes within those little caskets I've shown you, they would add pearls and jewels, corals sometimes, and gold leaves or gold pieces, crystal. They kind of, we don't know why, but clearly seems like a form of protection as a species, sort of guarding the relics. And after all, the Dharma, the doctrine, is seen as a jewel within the Buddhist tradition. And the body of the Buddha is often described as a bejeweled body, even if it's unadorned. So the metaphor of gem is very, of a jewel, and a gem is very strong in the Buddhist tradition. So they'd learned there were all these goodies in stupas. And so the first thing they would do, they would open up stupas, and, they were already crumbling. So take a few stones out and just take that stuff off. But the British themselves at some point started putting regulations on the the taking of sculptures from monuments, because that had become a big problem already at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, these officers were raiding monuments like nonstop. And so they actually they put this Treasure Troves Act in place, where they controlled. I mean, they actually required the officers that if they had found, at least this is in Swat in the Northwest, if they found Gandharan art, they were required to report it immediately to the political agents. And that was then, these pieces were stored and then sent to the very first museums that were established in the area. So this awareness of looting the started quite early. Yeah. And then, earthquakes, invasions, and you name it. Yeah.
Well,
I hope this answers your question, Annie.
Another question from Facebook by Becca Henry, asking, would people lay offerings directly on the hands of the stone Buddha carvings?
So yes, I think we should imagine this offerings of flowers That's garlands that were probably just like, I think, we tend to see Buddhism as this sterile religion that is, and especially ancient Buddhism, as not alive. Like Hindu images for us are very alive in worship, but we don't have the same. We tend to shy away from imagining devotion to the Buddha in the same way we see it today in a Hindu temple for an ancient image. But I do think that there was a lot of that too. Certainly there were music. There was music. There were sort of festivals with music, offering of garlands and incense. I'm not sure they would put it directly in the hands of the Buddha, but certainly around. And I think a lot of those vessels that we saw from that, the last slide, along with the ivory tusk, I think they would offer things in those containers and they would be stored somewhere else. But certainly flour and incense, and they were part of the offerings, the ritual offerings.
And now that you mentioned the ivory tusk again, considering the preciousness, the value of ivory, I imagine that site was the patronage of that site would have been a wealthy patron.
Absolutely. I think so too. And that site was actually quite a rich site. Must have been a major city, Barikat. The position, its position on the Swat Valley is actually, I couldn't show everything, but I went through this marathon in an hour because I wanted to show these images from Barikat because, we talk about Buddhism, we talk about stupas and things. And so I thought, no, let's talk about Buddhism in the city a little bit. The city is positioned in a very good location, not far away from the Swat River, on a kind of higher elevation, but, right next to the water. So it's protected, it's accessible. It was mentioned in Alexander's sources. It was a big deal. It was a big city. There was money, there was financial well-being, and there were rich patrons, I think. And so the ivory tusk makes sense.
Yeah. And so I think we have time for one more question. Again, from Becca Henry over at Facebook. You mentioned a continuation and even resurgence of Buddhism in the 5th century. Was there a point where the creation of these images and sculptures, monasteries and such, started to actually die out or fade? Why did this happen? Was it a result of colonialism?
Okay, so Buddhism, in reality, what happens after the fall of the Kushan kings, I think some Buddhist centers, there are all these different people coming in. So some Buddhist centers remain important, others die down. The political scenario changes. And so also the economic scenario changes. And so the landscape is quite different. The idea was that these Huns, the Huns are always associated with narratives of destruction, wherever they are in the world. But it's not necessarily true, because what we see here actually is that, for instance, in Swat, the Alkan Huns become patrons at Buddhist sites. Okay, we have evidence we have coins, inscriptions, maybe not them directly, but clearly certain sites went on. Others died out, whatever patronage. And this is also tied to, change of commercial routes, change in the itineraries. So a lot of that comes into play. So really, Buddhism did not die or fade away. Certain sites lost their strong pattern. There were so many that were established. So naturally, some of them kind of slowly died down. And others continued. So it was focused on less sites, but it still continued. Buddhism in the area started to fade with the arrival of Islam. And that's how it did. So by the time the British were in the region, Buddhism had died already. So these monuments were really seen as monuments, remnants of a past and that tradition. But they still kept the memory of it. And that's what the British hanged on to.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. And Pia, I want to give you a big, big thank you for being here with us today.
My pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here.
Yes,
Thank you.
you're welcome. And I want to give a big thank you to our digital team as well for producing this program, and to Chandy Kelly for coordination. And finally, a thank you to the audience for sharing this experience with us. We welcome you back for more programs on our social platforms. And for upcoming programming, please visit our website at thewalters.org. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you all.